The agenda this week: consider a new way of doing capitalism, examine the root of racial bias, and weigh the West's comfort with a more muscular Russia. The agenda's week in review begins with Election 42. Okay, Tim, in your view, what were Canadians saying last night?
Bye-bye, Stephen Harper. How about that, Steve? I think it was a change election on a number of different fronts. You talked about the number of new Liberal MPs. There are over 200 new MPs. That's almost two-thirds of the Parliament. That's a generational change that's happening there across the board. There was a change current that was out there that Justin Trudeau successfully was able to manifest for his advantage. He was able to take away from the NDP a good degree of support, and the Conservatives couldn't grow their support. Why couldn't they grow their support? I think Canadians got a little sick and tired of being punched and decided to punch back. I think the tone of the Conservative government at the end was what sank them in large measure. You can only be punched in the face so often before you throw one back at somebody else.
We'll follow up on that tone comment in a second. Supriya, what would you add to that about what Canadians were saying last night?
I mean, the one thing I would add is that the campaign that the Conservatives ran was also a little bit disjointed in terms of what they were putting as their message. So at first we thought it was going to be about leadership, then about the economy, and then halfway through we started talking about values, you know, and then they did that weird prop thing with the Price is Right kind of gimmicky stuff. It just seemed to be all over the place to me, and I think what Canadians were really saying, you know, and I don't discount the change vote at all whatsoever, but I think that does a little bit of a discredit to the kind of campaign that the Liberals ran, which was, you know, very positive. And they reached over 11 million Canadians in the past year in door knocking. The last 5 days, they got to 1 million doors. That matters, and I realize that's the one common, you know, cliche to say in all campaigns. But you know, door knocking really does make a difference.
Kathleen.
The change vote did really matter. I mean, poll after poll showed that 70% wanted Harper out. I think, you know, to Mr. Mulcair's credit, he did very poorly, obviously, last night. He can't be happy with the result. New Democrats aren't happy with the result at all. But I think that one thing that he could claim some credit for is the fact that he did help to wear down Stephen Harper over the last number of years while he was in the House of Commons, and actually really expose Harper's agenda. Unfortunately, Mr. Trudeau, to his benefit, was the benefactor of Mr. Mulcair's work in many ways. And Supriya's right. The Liberals ran a fantastic campaign, and they should be credited for that.
It's often the case in politics that he who opens the door isn't necessarily the person who gets to walk through it, right?
Yeah, or he who wields, you know, the knife doesn't get to wear the crown, right?
There you go.
A famous saying, yeah.
Andre.
One thing that I really noticed was that as far as the NDP goes, I mean, they had a huge sweep in the last election in Quebec and in Toronto as well. And you know, we had a lot of when we did the live podcast last night, we had a lot of NDP supporters, but unfortunately, inside of the 416, they just got swept right out. And I think that speaks to a bit of a crisis in leadership. You can't claim to be the party of progressive values and then not claim progressive values during your campaign. And I think we saw a huge rightward tack during the NDP campaign. We didn't hear much about poverty reduction. We didn't really hear much about childcare. And I think you know, those messages just didn't resonate with progressive voters. A lot of them were left off the map. Some people just didn't even bother to show up and vote.
We've got some maps up right now which show that the NDP got wiped out in the city of Toronto, the 416, the capital city of Ontario. If you add the provincial seat situation to this map as well, I guess that takes you to about 47 ridings. 45 of them are Liberal right now. Yeah. 2 New Democrats, 0 Conservatives, federally or provincially, in the 416. Unprecedented. Jonathan, what else would you add to that?
You know, speaking of the 416 and some of the ads that ran, I remember for me a defining moment of this campaign in terms of the positives and negatives. I remember I was watching the baseball game over the weekend, and this Conservative ad played over and over and over, and it was this dark shot ad, this sort of cranky narrator showing at first not Justin Trudeau but Kathleen Wynne, and telling me how horrible she is and what an awful person. And look, here's Justin Trudeau touching her, and there's just no, but just this. And you know what? I didn't vote for Kathleen Wynne. I don't, you know, you take it or leave it, but she's my premier. And like, what is up with this relentlessly negative ad just telling me how horrible my premier is, and look, how horrible is this guy for being friends with? And I remember being kind of sickened by it. And then they showed it over and over. And then juxtaposed with that was the Trudeau ad, which, I mean, was fairly vapid. I mean, it was just sort of like feel-goodery. But at least it was positive. At least it had a positive feel-good message. And from an emotional point of view, I remember thinking, like, I've just absolutely had enough with this relentless negativity. After 78 days of this toxic stuff about how everybody else is weak and stupid except for Stephen Harper, that's why they lost.
And you mentioned, Jason Kenney mentioned it, tone. You just used the word tone. Why did either the Prime Minister or the people around him not seem to understand that people had had it with that tone?
Well, I think the challenge Stephen Harper had and other leaders have this. When they have political success doing a certain thing, so being doctrinaire, being disciplined, having a language that manifests itself around that, it's very hard for them to change. One of them, back to the word change, one of the weaknesses of the Conservative campaign wasn't that there wasn't a willingness to embrace new ideas, new approaches, and an assumption, and a very false one, about the weakness of their opponents. I mean, what was this long campaign designed to do? It achieved one of the things it was designed to do, which was stall NDP momentum. When the race started, the NDP were ahead. They wanted to take some of the oxygen out of that. They hoped over the tenor of the 11 weeks that Mr. Trudeau would stumble and fall. That obviously didn't happen. And the other quick lesson with this, expectations. They thought Mr. Trudeau would not be able to perform in an admirable enough way that he'd win the support of Canadians. He more than did that, and the NDP were guilty of that as well. I mean, Mr. Mulcair talking about wiping the floor with Mr. Trudeau. The lessons here are pretty simple, Steve, when it comes to how you set up and manage a campaign. And the final thing I would say in answering your question is, you know, the Conservatives are guilty, as the Liberals were before, of assuming the arrogance of power and not being able to disassociate themselves from it and not being able to hear what everybody in this room and across the country has heard.
You helped Justin Trudeau write his autobiography, so I want to put this to you. Tim is right. The campaign was as long as it was in the hopes, partially, that Trudeau would put his foot in his mouth or stumble or do something like that. Instead, he turned out to be far more energetic, far more disciplined, far more far better than anybody thought he would be. Why do you think that? You know him better than anybody at this table. Why do you think that was?
Part of it is I just think his relentless physical energy, and he's a guy who just, he's like the living embodiment of some kind of Tony Robbins seminar. Like, I mean, it's just, no, but he's just, and well, I mean, but I don't mean.
Jonathan, where were you last week? That could have been a Conservative commercial.
By the way, just, you know, for legal purposes, without the creepy Tony Robbins aspect. I just mean like no, but I mean, he is a relentlessly upbeat guy with a ton of energy, and I think physical energy goes into it. A lot of times you see people on the campaign trail, they're haggard, they're grumpy. Part of it is just being worn down by 16-hour days, and I don't think that that was a factor for Trudeau. He loves physical challenges, and to go 78 days without being grumpy, without having a major gaffe, that's unbelievable. I mean, I can't go through a single day without being grumpy and unpleasant. And this guy went through 78 days. I mean, that's actually an amazing thing. The Conservatives thought they were going to get this guy out of the game after 4 innings and get 5 or 6 runs off him. Instead, it was essentially like a 3-hit complete game with an amazing box score. And I think people will be studying this campaign for decades and let's say, what did he get right? It was positive. He didn't make mistakes. He was underestimated, and he had a government that, in this case, was unpopular and that shot itself in the foot with negative messaging.
When you first heard about this, what'd you think?
Well, I thought it was a pretty smart move by the Ontario government, and we've been hearing a lot about the auto industry recently, especially around the Trans-Pacific Partnership talks, and what that could mean for the industry. And we had Unifor, the union that represents auto workers, saying it could mean the loss of up to 20,000 jobs in Ontario because of the fact that Canada's auto market would be opened up to a lot of other lower-cost jurisdictions. So then the question becomes, how do you compete? And I think this is not exactly a wholesale answer to the problem, but what Ontario needs to do is be on the front lines of new technologies like self-driving cars. And it's actually done quite well so far. We have the cluster in Waterloo of tech companies that are good at this kind of thing. And so the question is, how do you stay good, of course? And so the government decided that what we want to do is make Ontario the very first province in Canada that will allow testing of self-driving cars, not just on campuses in controlled situations, but actually on public roads. And so that's what's starting January 1st.
I mean, they're selling this as a job creator. Do you see it that way?
Well, it is and it isn't. I know that's sort of a nothing answer, but the the way it will help to create jobs is that it will prevent jobs from leaving, if that makes any sense. So right now, as it stands before these new regulations come into place, if you are an Ontario-based company, and there are 100 approximately companies and institutions in Ontario that make self-driving technology or connected car technology, you actually have to go stateside or to Europe to test that right now, because there's no way to do that legally in Canada. There are 3 or 4 states that allow testing, but currently nothing in Canada. So the temptation is for these tech companies that make this technology and these auto parts companies that make this technology to go to the States. And if you have to do your testing there, then the theory goes you might as well move jobs there as well, production there as well. But if you can do the testing at home in Ontario and you already have a base here or you're located here, then it makes sense to stay here.
It saves those, but one wonders, you know, as you go further down the road, and it's not just little cars that we're talking about, but perhaps big transport trucks, if you see a whole, you know, a whole kind of industry disappearing, like the truck driver, gone.
Or taxi drivers would be another example. Yeah, no, that's true. And I think the question is it inevitable? And if it is inevitable, and whether we're talking about 10 years from now, 20 years, 30 years, if it's coming anyway, do we need to be on the front lines of it? And I think the answer is yes, because this is such an important technology. This is where the jobs of the future are going to come from, in developing this technology. And so if Ontario can make it appealing for those companies to stay here and test their technologies here, then that's not going to hurt the industry in the long run.
I know it's a bit of a ridiculous thing to say in a city where it can take more than an hour to get anywhere, but sometimes driving is fun, actually. Do you think commuters, as a general rule, are going to go for something where they're no longer in the driver's seat, and you know, not pun intended?
Well, that's a good question. I remember reading the comparison once of self-driving cars today to the way the automobile was seen in the very early days versus horse-drawn carriages. And it was, you know, will we have no more need of horses anymore now that we have a car? And the answer is mostly yes, but people who like to ride horses for fun still ride horses for fun, racing and dressage, whatever. So down the road, you might have a situation where if you're commuting, you don't want to, it's not fun driving in traffic on the highway to and from work every day, right? So that you could do in a self-driving car, you can get work done while you're doing it. But if you want to go out on a track on the weekend to drive around in a high-performance sports car for fun, you could still do that potentially.
You refer to in the book a bill that was making its way through the California Assembly, which I gather would reduce the level of corporate tax paid by a company if the ratio between what the executive made and the average worker made was lessened. Where's that at nowadays?
Well, there are rumors that California is going to take it up again. The California business community and its related allies were very much against it. I think it's a step in the right direction. What you want to do is create incentives upon a company that move in the opposite direction from the way the incentives have been working to date. Not to provide greater and greater rewards to people at the top and push wages down for everybody else, but actually to limit executive compensation and spread the benefits of that productivity of that company. That's the way it used to be in the 1950s and 60s when we had strong labor unions. We don't have strong labor unions. What other incentives can we use?
Is that an inappropriate incentive into the glories and magic of the free market?
Well, if you think that there is some glorious magicality that attends to the free market, it would be an intrusion. But if you accept my premise that the market is a human creation and it is created by politicians and judges and administrative agencies who are influenced by very wealthy people, big corporations and so forth, then what you have to have ultimately is a countervailing power to get some balance into the system.
There's a fellow that you quote in the book, the Harvard economist Gregory Mankiw, who asks what seems like a reasonable question. How do we help people at the bottom rather than thwart people at the top? Is that a fair question to ask?
It's a fair question on one level. Obviously, if you're concerned about poverty, you really do want to do a variety of things that help people at the bottom. It's an unfair question, though, if you assume that what happens to people at the top doesn't affect the middle class. That is, the middle class in the United States is being squeezed as more and more income and wealth goes to the top. And if the middle class is squeezed, politically, there's no way that you're going to get a majority in favor of helping the bottom, because a squeezed middle class is not going to be generous. There's not going to be that many opportunities of ladders of opportunity for the poor into the middle class if you have few slots in the middle class to occupy. So from a larger perspective, looking at the political economy as a whole, the Menke position that you ought to just look at the poor just is ludicrous.
It is not coincidental, you tell us in the book, that 1928 and 2007 marked the two peaks of income concentration in America over the last 100 years, in which the richest 1% raked in more than 23% of total income. As I write this, you say, at the start of the 2015, a recovery of sorts is underway in the United States. Jobs are returning. But most people's wages are still not rising, and wealth and income are still at near record levels of concentration. The richest 400 Americans have more wealth than the bottom 50% of Americans put together. The wealthiest 1% own 42% of the nation's private assets. And the share of wealth held by the lower half of households has fallen from 3% in 1989 to 1% today. In your view, if this trend were to continue, what threat would it pose to capitalism in general?
Well, it's not sustainable. In narrow economic terms, if the vast middle class doesn't have enough income, they don't have enough purchasing power to keep the economy going. You know, people at the top don't spend all their income. They can't possibly spend hundreds of millions of dollars a year or $1 billion of wealth. They save it, and their savings go around the world to wherever they can get the highest return. So you have to have a certain degree of inclusiveness, a certain degree of not necessarily numerical equality, but a widened circle of prosperity just to keep an economy going. But I also don't believe it's sustainable politically and morally. I think people are already catching on to the fact that the American system is rigged. They're getting angry. This brings back the Trump and Sanders phenomenon. The choice ahead may be either, and it may not be in 2016, Steve, it could be 2020 or 2024, either authoritarianism or fundamental basic reform like we saw in the progressive era.
This is the one thing I don't understand about your country. If it were going to if the revolution were going to happen, surely 2008 would have been the best reason to have it happen. After the robber barons, you know, after Wall Street did what it did to Main Street, and nobody went to jail, and nothing happened. Nobody went to jail. If it didn't happen then, what makes you think it's going to happen going forward?
Because I think that the seeds of what we're now seeing with Trump and Sanders were actually planted in 2008. That Tea Party movement, the Occupy movement, the anger and crony capitalist assumptions that most people have about the game being rigged really began then with the bailout of Wall Street. And it's not going away. It's growing.
You don't need to be a fan of Putin, which I'm not, to see the hypocrisy of U.S. foreign policy here. We can go back before 2003. What happened the last time the U.S. supported the so-called moderate opposition in Afghanistan? We get the Taliban. What happened the last time the U.S. overthrew a dictator in the Middle East? We get the Iraqi civil war and ultimately ISIS. So when Putin is urging caution, obviously part of it is self-serving rhetoric, there's no doubt. But it has links to real problems in the Middle East that the U.S. and the West helped to create. And again, I'm not a fan of Assad, you know, the human toothbrush that, as Christopher Hitchens used to call him. He's not a good guy, but who are we arming against them? Are they worse or are they better? U.S. officials have admitted that they've handed over weapons to rebel fighters who, as soon as they cross the border into Syria, hand them over to local al-Qaeda representatives. So now that they are bombed by Russia, do they suddenly become, they magically transform from moderates to Islamist fighters or vice versa? Who is operating there? We don't know. So there's a deep hypocrisy in the U.S. foreign policy here that I think is obvious.
Okay, I want to keep it back on Russia. Do you have anything to add about the Russian angle on this?
Yeah, not to mention the double standard. Putin is making a foreign intervention. Now, Russia has been interested in the Levant, and Syria and Iraq, since the 1800s. And was going to be defender of the Christians of the area. This is a problem like the Archbishop, the Metropolitan of Moscow said we have to go and defend the Christians of Syria. So Russia has long-standing interests there. But look, for us to blast Putin for this one small, modest-sized operation, while the United States is just sending troops into West Africa, for God's sakes, with aircraft and drones and Marines, and U.S. forces are bombing Afghanistan every day and bombing in Iraq every day and in East Africa. It's it's not only hypocrisy, it's completely out of any kind of focus.
Okay, with 5 minutes to go, let me try and get a couple of more things on the table here. Since it's pretty clear America under Barack Obama does not want to put boots on the ground in Syria, right? I think everybody's agreed on that.
Definitely.
And Russia does and may do more, although not, I mean, we're not talking Vietnam here or anything like that. What other options does the United States have right now in order to try to impose its will in the region against Russia? Besma, you want to start us on that?
To be honest with you, I think there's nothing left for them to do. And it's the Syrian civilians that are going to pay the ultimate price. I mean, there were a lot of stuff we could have done. We could have taken out Assad's airports. We could have taken out all of those airport strips that, you know, that were taking off the military aircraft that bombed all these civilians. We could have put a no-fly zone. I mean, there were so many things we could have done. Now, it's an absolute mess.
Too late now?
It's absolutely too late. The only thing that can be done is, I think, push all of the international forces together, including the Chinese, which we don't talk about because they're the ones now basically allowing the Russian regime to survive by buying their gas. We need to put an international pressure together to put a political solution in place. Absolutely, that's the only thing that can be done by the Americans.
Hussein, what options do you think America has right now?
I'm not quite as pessimistic as that. I mean, it's never too late, right? Because history moves on. Change still occurs, so it is possible for those who can influence to influence things in a better or worse way. And so I think the United States can do everything that Besma laid out, and I think that was right. But in addition to that, it can certainly work with its allies, the Turks, the Saudis, the Jordanians, and others, on things like refugee safe havens. And there is a potential with an understanding with Syria for no-fly zones. There is a potential for still some kind of intervention that secures at least humanitarian interests, right? And people are being bombed here with not only barrel bombs, but I think Assad is starting to use chemical weapons again, something we haven't mentioned. But he and with the backing and protection of his Russian friends have used chemical weapons against civilians, right? All of that has to stop. And I think there's still a lot the United States can do in addition to trying to work out an international campaign.
Eric, are there any other good options left for the United States?
No, they're not. Well, diplomacy is the option, clearly, as President Putin has made clear again and again. But what the U.S. is doing, the U.S. too many bad cooks are spoiling the broth in the Middle East, running U.S. policy. The U.S. is now bringing in heavier and heavier weapons, sending in tow anti-tank missiles, sending anti-aircraft missiles. It's, I believe, that the U.S., France, and Britain have special forces secretly operating in Syria, too, as they did in Libya. So there's a lot of covert action going along. But the U.S., is, as I said earlier, is foolish. Why pick a fight with Russia over unimportant Syria when it's close to a war with Russia over Ukraine and close to a war with China at the same time? They need to back down, cut out the inflammatory rhetoric. Russia clearly does not want a major war over this area, but it doesn't want the U.S. to run roughshod over a place that is as close to Russia as Miami is to New York.
Seva, let me try to bring sort of the Canadian angle into this a little bit. Justin Trudeau, the new Prime Minister, has said, well, he promised during the campaign and in his conversation with Barack Obama, he did say Canada's involvement in the bombing missions over Syria, once he takes over, are done. Does that matter?
Not really. It matters at the margin. What really matters here, and there's no way around it, is for the West to engage Russia directly and constructively. And Western policymakers have refused to do that because they have some very strange assumptions about what drives Russian foreign policy. There's this idea that Putin is operating from a position of strength, taking advantage of American weakness. But in fact, it's Russia that's in the position of weakness here, potentially growing weakness. It has serious economic problems, very few allies, even fewer levers of influence outside of its immediate sphere. So this idea that Putin is being daring or decisive or proactive is nonsense. Russian foreign policy has been reactive, not proactive. It feels continuously threatened by the West. New U.S. bases in Central Asia, fights over the Arctic,
destabilization in Ukraine by Western elements, which is the way Russia sees it, NATO expansion. So Russia is acting out of a sense of fear and paranoia, not as a thorn in the side of the West, and certainly not in the interest of being daring.
During the Police Services Board meeting in Peel, the last meeting on September 25th, we heard one woman talk about her 2 children. One, you know, when he's buying items in a shop, he makes sure that he holds them up because he feels he's constantly being profiled. The other son, she said, before he enters into his car, same thing. He makes sure he looks, you know, like an upstanding citizen, takes off his hat, has his ID with him.
When you talk to the police and you get their side of the story and their explanation for why young black men in Peel region appear to be disproportionately carded, what's the explanation that comes back?
Well, this is what's most troubling about this issue, is that when we, through Freedom of Information, received the data from Peel, and then we analyzed it, and we reported on it, and we found that blacks, over a 6-year period, black individuals in Brampton and Mississauga were 3.6 times more likely to be stopped in a street check or carding stop than white people were. When we went to the Chief of Police, Jennifer Evans of Peel Police, and we asked her at the Police Services Board meeting, why is your force so disproportionately stopping black individuals? Her response was, and I quote, "I don't know." Now, she followed that up by saying she intended to find out, but herein lies the problem. If the force doesn't know why it's happening, how can you expect the individuals who are being subjected to the practice to have any kind of an idea why they're being exposed and so detrimentally impacted, you know, by this practice that can have real deep psychological, you know, effects? It really scars these individuals. And like I said, I think for a lot of us, I've never been stopped. And, you know, perhaps you've never been, perhaps you've never been. But when you speak to people who've been stopped numerous times, it's still difficult for us to understand how it affects them.
I think it goes beyond that because, correct me if I'm wrong here, the City Council in Mississauga asked, or was it Peel Council, asked the chief to stop doing carding, and she said no.
Yeah, it was actually the Peel Police Services Board.
Okay.
So the board that the chief is responsible to and answers to voted to suspend the practice, but because it was ruled or deemed that it was an operational matter, and the board technically doesn't have decision-making powers over operational matters, the chief said, I refuse to suspend it. She hangs on to the notion that it's too effective a policing tool to stop. But again, where's the evidence? They gave 6 examples, 159,000 street check entries over 6 years, and they were able to come up with 6 examples of incidents where a street check was actually used to help solve a crime.
Okay, let's see if we can get, we've set up the discussion now, let's see if we can get into some solutions here and what we might be able to do about this. And Shaquille, I'll get you to comment on this first. We're going to show a clip. This is a clip of a video that is used as part of police training. You would not expect the people in this clip to be part of police training. But I gather there's a method to the madness. So let's play this and then we'll come back and chat. Roll it, please, Sheldon.
I am 47. And that's just one side of me.
Okay, what's the dream?
I'm trying to be a professional singer.
And why hasn't it worked out so far, Susan?
I've never been given the chance before, but here's hoping it'll change.
Okay, everybody, well, I shouldn't say everybody. Most people, I think, know Susan Boyle, Simon Cowell, from that show on the other side of the pond. What possibly does that have to do with policing?
Well, I think it has a lot to do with it because you can see in the clip right away that both the audience as well as Simon are reacting to her, to what she looks like. They have no idea what's inside. They're judging her in terms of her appearance and how she talks. And they do not actually know her power. They do not know her skills or her attributes until she starts singing. And that's what the unconscious, as well as conscious biases are, is that we make prejudgments. Some of those are obvious. Like, most of us can look at that and go, oh yeah, we kind of see what's happening. There's a stereotype that might be at play. But a lot of the times it's unconscious and it's even less subtle. In this particular case, most people can watch this and go, oh look, and then when they start seeing the results and they start hearing her sing, all of a sudden they may also confront their own expectations. And it's the idea that our unconscious bias puts people into categories in which we have low expectations of some, high expectations of others. Some are registered as threats, some are registered as positive. And so that.
But there are tough on crime people who think that there is a good reason why, when you walk down a street in any town, North America, and you see a 16-year-old black kid with his cap on backwards and his jeans down to his knees, chains on, looking tough, why they ought to be concerned about that. Never mind the implicit bias or whatever. They think there's a legitimate reason why they have a concerned reaction to seeing that. Are we saying they're wrong to have that reaction?
Well, two things. One is that that image is what has been portrayed as dangerous and criminal, right? So that affects us both consciously and unconsciously. Now, people who are actively saying, and I believe all of this, or I've had, or I know people who, everyone seems to have some kind of a story of where something didn't go well with someone who's a racial minority, and so on. So there's two levels of that. And I would actually say that, yes, it is actually wrong. And that's where we need to catch ourselves, because we will be underestimating and in some cases making judgments that result not just in a little bit of unfairness, but could potentially threaten someone's life, that young child's life. And we've seen that happen over and over again in the context of policing. We see that in the education system. We see that racial minorities and Aboriginal students, for example, are
streamed into technical fields and so on.
But also,
at the least,
yeah, that's right. And the punishments that are meted out are definitely not the same as their white, more normative peers. So we see that has an impact. And so, yes, we all have to pause. That's one of the first things around implicit bias, is to A, recognize we have it, and B, that it is going to affect our judgments. And we need to pause and be able to kind of go, how much of this is real? How much of this isn't? How much have I made up? And that's how we learn.
And that is our Week in Review. You can see all of those programs in their entirety. They're all on our website at tvo.org, on our iTunes channel, and on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/The Agenda.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.